Hi. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic.online. Go visit us over there for high quality humanities educational materials and thought provoking discussions. Bob Schut and I are going to be having a discussion, I believe our 11th discussion of Soren Kierkegaard's Training in Christianity. Take it away, Bob.
Okay, well, today, Luke, we're going to be discussing the direct versus indirect communication, how God can only be communicated indirectly, how faith is elicited, and Christianity and the modern philosophy. So that should be a kind of a handful of subjects.
No, that's pretty easy. Easy breezy. Doesn't sound too challenging at all.
Okay. Well, in our age, and this is Kierkegaard speaking, in our age, they know no other way of communicating without the way of lecturing. Probably very similar today, but we use YouTube for our lecturing now, but it's probably very similar. And in this manner, the lecturer is the objective mediator. So it takes a little explanation. We'll go through it. So the lecturer, Kierkegaard calls an objective mediator. In this way, everything must be communicated directly. So he's going to give us a little bit more about that. Communication is merely reduplication of what is communicated in the sense of the news. One who reports the news is simply reduplicating the event as a mediator. So I know we probably never really thought about it this way, but the broadcaster on the news, who's giving us the news, is not part of the news. He's simply reduplicating what it says on his teletype machine or on his monitor, and he's just broadcasting it. That's direct communication, when it's a reduplication. So
you know, if anyone wants to have a good little chuckle that'll make you feel a little dead inside at the same time, I don't know if you've ever seen these compilations of newscasters that are reading off the teleprompter, and they're all reading the exact same script because the media organizations are centrally controlled. The exact same media companies tell them what to say. Have you ever seen one of those?
No, I've never. I think you mentioned that to me one time before, but I've never actually seen it.
Yeah. So there's Conan O'Brien used to put them together for laughs, but they're a little bit chilling. You should check it out.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. But, he says, when it comes to being or existence, it's not understood directly. It requires reflective understanding of the individual. So, it is the case where the communicator is actually involved in the news. So, I'm thinking, what would be the difference? Maybe like a war correspondent who's actually there in the middle of the battle, being part of the battle, reporting on the battle, as opposed to somebody sitting in reading it off the teletype that comes in. So maybe that might be a good example of what he's trying to tell us. Or when we see the weatherman out in the snow, he doesn't have to tell us it's snowing here. We can see it. He's part of the report. So those are the...
And sometimes a reporter can insert themselves into the narrative, right? So,
yeah.
And how they're trying to directly communicate these supposed objective events, right? So one of them that we might think of would be, I believe in the early 2000s, Dan Rather suffered a major snafu because he supposedly published some erroneous information on George W. Bush's National Guard service, and then he became part of the story, and that was the end of Dan Rather's journalism career. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do something about that. Not the details, but I do remember something like that, right?
And I actually think people probably remember that being the thing that took Dan Rather down more than they realized what the story about George Bush's National Guard service was. Mm-hmm. But that might be an instance, and we see that today too. When you have very emotive newscasters mm-hmm. who will cry on camera when they're reporting a certain event in order to charge up the emotional base of the people listening.
Yeah.
That's something to take into consideration. So Yeah. That might be another way to weave the person into it.
True. So there's that kind of difference in communication, which if we can keep that separate from each other, we can differentiate between direct and indirect. And Kierkegaard says that this is the case when it comes to the God-man. So he's telling us that we cannot understand being, which involves the God-man, or man being God, through observation, which is direct. In other words, when Jesus is saying he's God-man, he's not reporting as a reporter, but he's being man, being God. This is the point I think he's trying to get to. And the only way to understand it is to reflect upon the idea, to think about it, which is what brings about the indirection of it. So the God-man is a sign of contradiction. So what makes it difficult is there's a paradox with a capital P here, that how can God be man or man be God? They're two totally separate things. By definition, they cannot be the same thing. So this is the sign of contradiction. One cannot tell someone who a person is. This would be direct communication or reduplication, where you're just telling somebody. Like, I could tell people who you are, Luke, by just reading off your history, and tell people where you went to college, what degrees you have, some of your personal life, and that would be direct communication. Okay, I would.
What a joke that biography would be.
The reduplication of Luke. Okay, that would be the title. But that would be an example, a real life example. I wouldn't be telling. I wouldn't be able to bring about your actual being, who you were. I'd just be reduplicating it and probably giving a false sense of who you were. So that's the difficulty when you're reduplicating in direct communication as opposed to indirect communication by being.
It'd probably be as good a guess as any. I don't even know who I am anymore. So.
Well, when one hears the saying directly, quotes unquote, I am God, the Father and I are one, which is what Jesus says one way or another, this would be a direct communication. So if Jesus simply says, or we read, it says, I am God, the Father and I are one, there's little reflection to understand what is being said. But when the individual man says it, in other words, as part of Jesus saying it, when we see it in the indirect manner, it's not clear how this is really possible for him to be God. So, I guess what we're talking about here is theoretically we can understand what Jesus is saying, we can understand the words, but we truly don't get a grasp of the meaning if we try to take it as a direct reporting of the news kind of thing, like Jesus is the newscaster saying, I am God, I and the Father are one. That would be direct. Exactly saying that as he's being God is a different level of understanding. Right?
You have to get closer to the truth somehow.
Right. And that's reflection, as he says, the means by which we do that. So I would say that he's trying to say here is that a man can understand it in the sense that he can make it into a doctrine by merely repeating it in the same form or another form, like many people do. They because they can say it doesn't mean they understand it. But because he doesn't understand the substance of what's really being said when somebody actually says it, or who makes the claim. So it removes the existential part of it. And I think this is what he's kind of getting at. What existentialists really are is not people who focus on the saying and the words, but on the being, the participating in reality of the event, not reporting the event. So this happens when there is an apparent paradox or contradiction and requires reflection, making it indirect communication. That's Kierkegaard speaking. The point is that this all brings a person to the point of choice. Do you believe him or don't you believe him? In other words, what Jesus is saying, do you believe him or don't you believe him? Not merely, do you know what he's saying? Did you hear him or didn't you hear him? But it's rather, do you really understand what he's saying here? And Kierkegaard tells us this is why indirect communication is necessary when it comes to these existential reality, existential truth. He says that the parson repeats over and over again with utmost assurance that Christ directly said that he's God and the only begotten of the Father. But this is hidden from the eyes, for they have done away with Christianity. It was a stumbling block. What Jesus said was a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. Because they transformed Jesus into a public person and not an individual. So in my words, I inserted what I don't think Kierkegaard would mind here, is that they've taken the real Jesus, the individual, the person, and they've created an abstraction who's not really an individual, but an ideology or almost an idol of him, and removed his true being and replaced it with the thinking Jesus rather than the being Jesus, if that's possible. So Christ has then become an abstraction. We understand it, and we accept it superficially, but it never really becomes a paradox. He said that he was the only begotten of the Father, which is repeated over and over again by the parson. But what does that actually mean? And what it means is it's a statement of being that Jesus... And this is one of the things that I think I've experienced in the latter part of my Christianity, is I was so focused on the words and what the words meant, that I was missing the existential part of Christianity as to what does Jesus really mean? Who is Jesus? What is his being? Not simply what is he saying, but what is he being? Who is he to me? What is this? People talk about the personal relationship, but I really don't think they grasp the meaning of what it means to have an existential relationship with God and with Jesus, through Jesus. Because what he says is a statement of being, not a statement of thinking. It's a contradiction and cannot be understood directly. And many things that Jesus says, and Paul says for that matter, are always on the verge of being a contradiction. A lot of people always like to say that, the Bible contradicts itself. Maybe it does in some places, but that's not bad. Sometimes contradiction is necessary in order to get the point across. And people fail to see that because they're looking for the words. They're looking for the truth in the words, not in the being. And sometimes being cannot be defined directly, but has to be defined indirectly, which may involve contradiction. So contradiction doesn't bother me. If somebody says, the Bible contradicts itself, I say, yeah, so what? That's part of the being of understanding. I know we probably have to come up with some specific examples, but anyway, just to give you an idea, that's how I would first look at it. The words or the...
Yeah. You know what it brings to mind is that that quote of Walt Whitman's, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes.
Yes. Okay. Well,
I know he was intending that for a different context, but I think it's interesting to perhaps give it give it from the perspective of God.
Yes.
And look, there are all sorts of contradictions all over the place, right? There are every mode of human knowledge, right, is replete with contradictions, right? Like physics and mathematics. There are contradictions in all human endeavors.
Yeah.
that are waiting to be resolved or may never be resolved. But we don't give up on physics. We don't give up on mathematics. We don't give up on biology or wherever else that we find contradictions just because we have contradictions.
Yeah.
We try that much harder to understand them. I think that the point of frustration here is that people find one contradiction in the Bible, which may be an illusion, maybe just totally an apparent contradiction and not a real contradiction, a logical contradiction, and say, therefore, I do not have to struggle with this text anymore.
Yeah.
Whereas there can be all sorts of contradictions in medicine and other domains. It's like, oh, that's cool, whatever.
Yeah, double standard.
We tend to have different expectations when it comes to contradictions in different fields.
True. So the words or the utterance, he says, cannot be direct. But since Christ is involved, and I kind of put being there, and is a sign of contradiction, it's turned into an indirect communication which requires reflection. So hopefully we're kind of grasping the terms here a little bit better. That indirect communication, which may involve contradiction, requires reflection in order to understand it. Because it involves being or existential reality rather than the intellectual reality, which...
Can you perhaps, or maybe you're going to get to it. So we've got a lot of words here.
Yeah.
Can we give some concrete examples and how an example of indirect communication communicates the being of the contradiction under study that ought to be decided for or against, whereas the direct contradiction, how that doesn't precipitate any sort of reflection and becomes sort of this doctrine that, rolls off your back like water off a duck's back.
Okay. Well, I wish I could give you a simpler example, but Christ being God is the one that Kierkegaard uses here. I don't think he gives another example. I think he gives us ideas that surround it, but let's try to come up with one, maybe.
Yeah. So the direct communication of that would be the sermonizer just being like, Christ is God, and he was necessary to be God in order to fulfill this grand eschatological plan where the sins of mankind are atoned for through this blood sacrifice, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
And we've built this doctrine up, versus an indirect communication of the humanity and divinity of Christ. What would that look like? Would that be a parable? Would that be a movie? Would that be a piece of music? What is this indirect communication, and how is that precipitating reflection that theological exposition is not?
I could give you a biblical example, probably. It was coming to my mind as you were speaking, versus the theological point of view. When we want to define God, we say Father, he's the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And can you say that, Luke? Can you say God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and the three? You can say that. And people think because they say that they've solved the problem. But who is God? Well, God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, all three persons of the Trinity. All three are equal. All three are God, fully man, all this. They could spout out all these doctrinal issues, and they think they've solved the problem. But Jesus doesn't present himself that way. Jesus says, you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And that would be an example of indirect versus direct. Jesus says, you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That requires thought. That requires reflection. But what does that mean?
Cryptic? Is it because it's necessarily cryptic and requires us to mull it over?
Yeah.
It's not fully developed? Is that indirect?
Indirect because it's a reflection of being. I think not necessarily everything that is like a koan or an idea that doesn't make sense and makes you think it's necessarily indirect. It just might be stupidity. It might be error. But in this case, what we have here is Jesus is speaking about being. And what he's saying is, if you've seen the Father, if you've seen the Son, you've seen the Father. That's a statement of being. It cannot be made directly. It cannot be understood directly. You see what I mean? So coming up with a doctrine, let's make that a doctrine, is not going to solve the problem. It's not going to help you understand what Jesus means anymore, unless you just get down and really say, I need to think about this and meditate on this. What is he trying to tell me here about being? So I'm not sure whether I've come up with a...
Right. So, I mean, I would say if that less than fully developed theological statement of Christ about, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, leads to a sense of mystery, which there is great mystery.
Yes.
In that, and there's great mystery in the way that Jesus defines himself versus we know God is the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
Mystery solved.
Yes.
We've got our theology worked out. But is the only thing that's supposed to be communicated in that moment is the mysteriousness of Jesus, or is it pointing to some other action that is divine in some way, such as excusing the sin of the adulterous woman, or multiplying fish and loaves, or walking on water, or something like that? Like, is it in reference to one of those things that communicates more than just mystery, but also mercy and also, supernatural dominance, things of this nature?
The example that comes to mind now, hopefully this is in the same, answers your question. When Jesus and Nicodemus were discussing things, and Nicodemus asks him, what he has to do, and Jesus says, you have to be born again. And Nicodemus thinks, you mean I have to go back into my mother's womb and be born again? I don't get it. And Jesus says, you're supposed to be a teacher of the Jews, and this is the best you got? So Jesus is trying to tell him something, and we might say, he's being cryptic. But he's not being purposely cryptic and mysterious. He's being indirect. How else do you explain to Nicodemus what he has to do? He has to come to this understanding by himself. He has to think about this. And instead he tries to take the easy way out, the doctrinal way out, and say, I guess I have to go back into my mother and get born again.
So let me see if I can clarify what you're saying here, so I can get my squirrel brain around this. From what I'm hearing here is that indirect communication is not mysterious for the sake of being mysterious and communicating a mysterious being behind these cryptic statements. The point of indirect communication is to inspire the curiosity of the person enough so that they make a decisive choice for the matter at hand, versus when it's directly communicated. When something is directly communicated, such as the Trinity or the God-man paradox in a theological treatise, it becomes sort of like foundational doctrine. It's not something that's really reflected on and chosen, right? It becomes merely sort of an abstraction that's batted around philosophically, if ever.
Yeah,
right.
Right.
It either becomes sort of something that we assent to in faith, or that we discuss philosophically but never really decide for or against because it's so,
right,
out there in the intellectual ether. But the indirect way of communication has an element of mystery, so that it leads the person to the precipice of choice, and will force them to go one way or another.
Yeah.
Whereas direct communication may not force an individual to choice, because so much is not left to the imagination. Do I understand this correctly?
It sounds like you got it. It sounds like you got it exactly right. Matter of fact, in my next two sentences here, I think I'm going to say the same thing that you just said. Maybe not as
Proceed.
not as eloquently as you did, really. But when he said, "Believe in me," it is a direct utterance, but can only be understood through indirect understanding. The Kierkegaard continues. Now, this is the sentence here. He says, "So Christ cannot give direct communication as to who he is. A direct utterance can only get people's attention through offense, but this offense brings people to the point of decision." So through the direct utterance, people are going to hear it and be offended at it because they don't understand it. They're going to, how can I say this? They hear the direct utterance, it's going to get their attention, but it's not going to be able to give them understanding. It's going to bring them to the point of decision.
So direct can lead them to the point of decision, but it's almost always negative, isn't it? Like if someone just goes around and makes a direct proclamation, it's very rarely successful in getting people to make the existential choice. Whereas the indirect communication that is less defined and more mysterious gradually seems to be more effective in the long run. But you're saying that the direct communication can precipitate choice as well.
That's what he's saying. That's what he's saying here. But if we continue on, maybe he'll explain it a little bit better for us. But I tend to agree with you here on this issue here. I think that the indirect communication brings about the sense of uncertainty and to the point of decision. But he gives us some examples. He play acts a little bit here, gives us a little scenario. But he says that, but Christendom has made Christ a speculative unity between God and man. So in theory, in what he calls theoretical, somehow God and man form this speculative unity that doesn't necessarily bring about confrontation or doubt or conflict, but something that man thinks he understands. Or they have thrown out Christ completely and kept only his teachings, making him into a pagan god. So there's like two different ways, he tells us. We can either take God and man, there are two wrong ways of doing it, based upon direct communication. So we can either take God and man and create some speculative unity that is void of being, but at least satisfies us theoretically, satisfies our intellectual curiosity, or to take Christ and completely throw out this idea of divinity and turn him into a pagan god by keeping his teachings, or a Socratic god, where he's just no better than Socrates, or maybe he is better, but he's no different than Socrates. Okay, so we kind of have those.
I completely understand that. I would think a lot of my philosophy education, my attitudinal approach was the former, was trying to understand this speculative unity. And for anyone who is trying to do that, I think you'll start to find that individuals start to take that as far as they can, and you get very far away from Christian doctrine. You start to get into like proto-Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Kierkegaard has Hegel in mind when he's talking about this speculative unity.
Many times he does seem to be speaking anti-Hegelian in his works. I think that was because Hegel was taking over the church. The Hegelian thought was taking over the church, right. and I think that's why he had this issue.
So we see how the being of Christ is lost if we speculate too much on Christ's humanity or on his divinity, right? In either direction that we go.
Yeah.
So, and we find that it either becomes, so I guess the question is, how does indirect communication preserve his being? And I think you're going to address that now.
Yeah, that's what we're going to unfold that here, because it's more than just one quick answer he gives us. If Christ is God, he must remain unrecognizable and assume an unrecognizableness, which is a negation of the direct. So now he brings in a new idea of being unrecognizable. So one of the things that people have against the gospel is that Christ does not say exactly who he is. He remains unrecognizable. And even then they were puzzled when they stood in front. Even his disciples were puzzled. Who is this man who can calm the seas? They could see what he was doing, but they couldn't make the connection. He was unrecognizable to them. Kierkegaard is trying to tell us this was necessary because this is a negation of the direct. Okay, so Kierkegaard seems to sometimes speak back and forth and seems to be playing with words at times. And perhaps one of the problems and the issues is the translation. I mean, I don't understand the Danish language, but I know that I know the Greek, and I know when we talk about the New Testament, and sometimes when we see something that is very difficult to understand in the English, if we go back to the Greek, it sometimes becomes a little more clear in the Greek. So it may be some of the things he's telling us here that we're trying to unpack is difficult because of the English translation. I don't know that for a fact, but I just know it seems it is a problem in languages.
But I can get my head around this, right? Like, if Jesus's actions are godlike, yet he refuses to answer the question directly and say 1,000 times, "Oh yeah, by the way, I'm God," and he leaves it sort of cryptically, where he's like, "Well, that's what you say I am."
Exactly.
Or could Satan drive out Satan, or whatever indirect way he alludes to it, right?
Right.
It preserves this sort of uncertainty so what I'm hearing here is that the nature of Christ's indirect communication prevented the apostles from becoming philosophers and prevented them from becoming sort of New Age mystics in this way. I mean that philosophers in the sort of Greek sense of it.
My next sentence here is just going to again reflect what you just said. He says that the direct recognizableness is a characteristic of paganism and their gods. So if Jesus would have said, "I'm God, don't you get it? I'm Yahweh, don't you get it?" they would have had a different idea of who he was, and it would have paganized Christ.
Okay, so I understand that. So what is so Christ's indirect communication of himself prevents him from becoming a pagan god or a thought concept or an ascended master, and this ambiguity of the indirect communication preserves his being. What is the difference between the being of Jesus and, say, Apollo?
Well, the obvious difference is one.
Yeah, they're obvious, but how do we if we compare and contrast them with a Greek god or something?
Okay. I was thinking of a different Apollo. I was thinking of Apollos in the New Testament. So you're thinking about the God. What's the difference between Jesus and between Apollo?
Or Zeus or whatever pagan god we want to choose.
Well, I think we can see, and now we probably have to do a detailed study, but I think, in generally speaking, the pagan gods were a result of direct communication. There was no indirect communication there, because there was nothing deeper to the god Apollo than what the high priests told you. So there was nothing really to meditate upon, because there was no being. Since they didn't exist, there was no being. It was all speculative due to the direct communication. Whereas case of Jesus, it's not speculation. He was an actual person who existed. So we can tie it into being. whereas Apollo never really was a person.
So how do we get the superior divine being of Jesus out of his indirect communication?
You mean how do we understand him, or how do you mean how do we falsely do it, or how do we
Are we properly to do it?
to properly through? Well, we'll probably get to that here, but the way that we properly do it is through the reflection, is through accepting the paradox as a paradox and not trying to resolve it. And this can only come through faith. But this is what brings on the whole idea of faith and produces faith. It cannot be understood through the intellect. It can only be understood, if we want to even call it that word, the paradox produces faith. This is the whole point of Jesus' ministry. Well, it was not to produce understanding. It was not to produce satisfy intellectual curiosity of the Jews, or to give them answers to their theological questions. It was to produce faith. So we have to understand it in that with that purpose. What was the gospel? It was a message used to produce faith.
So because Jesus never directly communicated him, but because Jesus engaged in indirect communication, he made the possibility of faith in him a thing.
Yeah.
Had he directly communicated himself, faith would be an impossibility.
Yes. It wouldn't be faith. It would simply be, what would I say, acceptance of the facts, or an intellectual satisfaction, intellectual knowing. It would have been knowledge rather than faith.
Right. So he had to sort of limit. He limited what he could say in order to make faith a possibility. So I think I can anticipate the question that someone would be having here and be like, well, why is faith so much more important than knowledge? Why did God want us to have faith rather than have knowledge of him?
And the reason is because faith is transformative and knowledge is not. Or I can put it this way. Knowledge transforms us into one type of a person. Faith transforms us into Christ. It transforms us into the kind of person God wants us to be. So
can you I know I want everybody to know that I'm like asking Bob to do some very difficult stuff today. But can you elaborate on this distinction about how knowledge can transform us and how faith can transform us? I mean, I think it's worth just elaborating.
Okay, I think that in quoting Paul, he says, knowledge puffs you up. And it makes you think higher of yourself. I'm very smart. I'm superior to all those people who aren't as smart. I have a high IQ. Therefore, I'm better than the people who have a lower IQ. And this is what Paul is saying anyway, that knowledge tends to make us think we're somebody when we're not. But faith, on the other hand, humbles us. It allows us to see Christ that's higher than we are, and to see other people higher, more important than we are.
So if we didn't have faith, we would start to elevate ourselves to the level of the Lord, wouldn't we?
Yes, we would.
And we would not truly understand the need for the Messiah.
That's right.
Would we?
No, we would not. Yeah.
Because whatever direct thing that he was going to communicate, we could understand and then ascend. And we could all become these ascended masters. And, it would be more about us and less about Jesus, wouldn't it?
It would be. And if we couldn't do it in one lifetime, we'd have to come back and try another one and keep repeating it until we finally reach that level. Does that sound familiar?
Yes, it does. And it's precisely this problem of becoming on the same level as God that got us into the predicament of needing Jesus Christ in the first place, right? Because it was in Genesis 3:22 when the serpent beguiles Eve by saying, oh, you will surely not die if you eat of this tree. Your eyes will be opened and you will be like gods, right? So that was the whole false promise, and the whole the whole perversion of nature occurred at that moment when the serpent promised that man could be elevated to the nature of God. And Jesus, by speaking indirectly, mysteriously, cryptically, but at the same time having actions that were God-like, reset the natural order so that man could regain his proper place as being below the Messiah and having Yahweh, Yeshua, and the Holy Spirit above him again. So indirect communication restores the order that the primordial man experienced?
It's the process.
Is that what's going on here? Is that what's going on here?
Yes, sir. It's part of the process. But what was the tree? Which tree did Eve eat from again?
The tree of knowledge and good and evil,
knowledge,
right?
Yeah, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Yeah.
Oh, so I guess what I'm trying to say here, there's this matter of direct and indirect communication can be, and the necessity for Jesus to employ indirect communication can be traced all the way back to the Garden of Eden.
All the way back.
They're continuous. But does Kierkegaard talk about that, or
I think he does. But not here. But I think he does. I can't remember which work he talks about the garden and Eve and the anxiety. The anxiety of, wasn't it the anxiety of death, or the anxiety? What was that? Yeah.
We talked about it in the concept of anxiety.
Yeah.
So it's not just that Jesus Christ offers salvation for the individual, but this is this process of Jesus coming into the world and indirectly communicating himself is setting in motion the restoration of creation.
He's called the second Adam. Yeah. That's why he's called the second Adam.
I think that's a pretty big breakthrough, Bob.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Absolutely is. Now, we look at the Pharisees, and what was wrong with the Pharisees? They were stuck on their knowledge of good and evil. Everything was based upon their knowledge of good and evil. They were able to put everything into categories. How far you could walk, how many words you could talk, how many, what you could do, where you had to be, when. And so it was so detailed because it was based upon the tree of knowledge of good and evil, so to speak.
So let me get this straight.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but I'm really, you got me all excited now. and you know how I get. So we rewound the tape and we can see how this event, this incursion into reality of Jesus Christ and his indirect communication is a way of resetting what went wrong in the Garden of Eden by man properly recognizing his humility before God and rooting out the pride, and that this is setting in motion the restoration of creation again. If this gospel of Jesus Christ spreads far enough to all the ends of the earth, will non-human creation follow suit too? Will it start to restore itself?
It will.
It's not just that man will restore himself in the proper chain of being, but will the lion lay down with the lamb because of this?
Maybe not the way you're thinking. Maybe not the way like the Genesis bomb that was on the Star Trek did, but there'll be a new heaven and a new earth. Okay, God creates a new heaven and a new earth for the new society, so to speak, for the new believers. That's going to be based upon this system of faith. So yeah, it will be restored in that sense.
Then it becomes a question of how many are needed, right?
The complete amount. In Revelation, it talks about the complete. He says, well, actually, the martyrs were under the altar complaining to God, so to speak. How long are you going to let this go on? And God says, until the number is complete.
So let me get this straight.
Go ahead.
Once this is all set in motion, every human being has to become a Christian
No,
before that can happen.
no, the ones who are what's the word, sealed. The number has to be sealed. That number God has in His mind has to be sealed. Those are the ones, and that's when.
So God's got the number.
God's got the number.
He's got a little
Calculator.
He's got a little calculator, and every time.
Well, I
clicks.
think this is more symbolic, but anyway, what we understand it is the perfect. And when he talks about the 144,000, the 12,000 times 12, 12 is a symbolic number of completion. So for the Jews, the number is a completion. But to Abraham, he says, remember the promise to Abraham, and he says to Abraham, I will multiply your ancestors to as many stars there are in the sky. So for us, we don't see it as a literal number, but for God it is. It is a completion. Not going to say it's how many millions or billions of people to the person, but rather there is a completion that God has in mind that must take place.
All right.
So I wouldn't say it's a number. I would say it's a completion for God.
But for every person that we facilitate in their salvation journey, we get that much closer to the restoration of the garden.
We could look at it that way. I don't see a problem looking at it that way. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
And so this would be a reason to be very vocal and assertive and active about the spreading of the gospel, because the spreading of the gospel will accelerate this restoration.
I don't know if
I'm just working through the
I would
theology.
say this though, Luke. We can't accelerate it or retract it or pause it, because that's not part of our knowledge. What is part of us is what we're supposed to do. We do our piece. When Jesus said, baptize, spread the word throughout the whole world to the ends of the earth, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's our great discipleship. That's what we're supposed to do. But there shouldn't be, this is the warning with that, is that there shouldn't be an alternative reason for doing it other than for the fact we want to bring people to the Lord. It's not too exact. And I know that's today that's very popular. Let's hurry up, and we're going to get to the end of the world. We're going to get the second coming. We have to get Jerusalem to do this and that. No, that's not the point. The point is we don't do it for that reason. We do it because we love other people. We want to bring other people into the ark, so to speak. Not because we have an ulterior motive to hurry up and bring this process along. So I just want to caution that.
I know. I got a little carried away there, but I just saw the whole of it kind of spread out before my mind, and I had to get it. I had to get it off my chest.
No, good. That's good. So they take a direct utterance and construct a sentimental figure in that image. So one of the other warnings Kierkegaard gives us is, we can eliminate the divinity or accentuate the divinity, or we can just simply take the words of Jesus and create some sentimental figure. We could take the Sermon on the Mount and do a crochet of it or something and post it up in our house. And there it is. It's all done. It's right in that framework, and we're done. It's a nice spiritual little sentimental message. And unfortunately, that's what's happening. Jesus' teachings are becoming more a sentimental message rather than a message of life and being, because they've removed the being from it and they're just left with the message. So we have to remember that with Jesus, it was the direct statement that he used to offend for the purpose of getting their attention. So a lot of times Jesus would use direct things. Your sins are forgiven. That was a direct message. What? You can't forgive sins, only God can forgive. He got their attention with that message. I think that's what Kierkegaard means by a direct statement. He made these direct statements that were outrageous. You can't say that. And it offended those people. So one is direct when one simply says the utterance. This is his words here. But when one is reduplicating it, when they simply say it or quote it from another, this is simply reduplicating. It's still direct. If you get up and you read the Sermon on the Mount out loud to people, in that respect, it's a direct reduplication. You're not living it out. You're talking about it. And this is the difference. And I think that this is where Kierkegaard had a problem with pastors in his day, because the pastors would read it, but they wouldn't live by it. They wouldn't exemplify a message. It's a message of being. You have to be this, not just say it. That was Kierkegaard's, and me too, actually, as you could probably tell. That motivates me. We must live the message, not just simply repeat the message, because then we're just giving it reduplication. We're newscasters. And we're not newscasters in the gospel. We shouldn't be, anyway, newscasters. And too many pastors are just that, newscasters. That's not what's expected.
Well, I wrestle with this, Bob.
Yes.
Because, and maybe this is something I need to change up in my life, but I don't have a lot of time, right? I don't have a lot of free time in my life.
Yeah.
And I feel like God has allowed me to see something, see some information, and be able to compile it and make sense of it in ways that others haven't.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel obligated to report this news to every single individual that I encounter.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to me, the fact that I'm taking the time to do that is living. That is an act of love. It's not something I want to do.
It is.
I have work to do. I have a company to build. I have lessons to prepare. I gotta work on my biceps. I got things to do. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't want to stay up for 5 hours explaining the same thing over again to people who don't even really want to comprehend it to begin with.
Yeah.
Am I just a news reporter, or am I a news reporter with a heart of gold? What's going on here? Am I not serving the kingdom when I do that? Am I not loving Jesus when I'm doing that?
You are doing it, but there's better ways to do it. Apollos was a minister, a pastor, or you might say, or an evangelist, who went around evangelizing about Christ. And he came to, what was their name? I'm trying to think of their names now. Aquila and Priscilla. And she said, yes, you have the message, but we need to teach you how to more accurately teach the message. Because he was preaching the message of the baptism of John, I believe, and he wasn't quite getting the full gospel message there. So we all experience what you're experiencing. We all sometimes get caught in the broadcasting the news idea. So we can't be too judgmental about pastors, but we hope that by the time they're elevated to the level of a pastor, that they would catch on. Unfortunately, that's not true. But there's a difference between explaining the gospel, which is what we want to do. We get so motivated, we want to explain to people who Jesus was, what he did. And there's also being a witness. Now, Jesus doesn't tell us to go and explain the gospel to people. He tells them to be a witness of the gospel. Now, the witness is a statement of being. It's not just simply saying, this is what happened. It's actually living it. This is what I saw. This is what I heard. This is what I tasted. This is what I touched. And this is what happened to me. I'm a witness. I'm not this is not a direct utterance. I'm not telling about a witness. I'm telling by showing I'm a witness. This is the indirect method. So we have to also be the indirect communicator. And we do that by being the message, not being the broadcaster.
This is very time intensive.
Didn't they explain this to you in the brochure, the Christian brochure?
I'm just trying to kill two birds with one stone. I have information for you, and the fact that I'm here telling you it is an act of love. Get it through your head.
And if you don't get it, you're going to hell.
No, I don't say that. I don't say that, but
Okay.
I got other people. I got other people I got to tell.
Yeah, I got it. So, okay, hopefully that may help a little bit. I don't know, maybe not. We'll see. Let's see. So where was it? But we have to remember that with Jesus, it was the direct statement that he used to offend for the purpose of getting their attention. So one is direct when one says the utterance, but when one is reduplicating it, when they simply say it or quote it to another. So one is saying something direct that can only be understood indirectly because it's encoded or symbolic or attached to being. So let me put it to you this way, because before you asked the question, and I don't think I gave you a good answer because I didn't have one. I think what Kierkegaard is saying here is that the message can be taken as direct or indirect. And I think this is what he's getting at here, is that Jesus can say something and it can be taken as a direct message and be misunderstood or bring you to the point of choice. But the indirect message is what you wind up with, because that's when being becomes attached to the message. So it's kind of like the parables, like you mentioned before. Jesus can tell a parable, and you might consider that when the disciples and the Pharisees heard it, they were taking it as a direct message and getting offended at it. But if they were taken indirectly, they would realize Jesus was speaking more about being than about a direct message. It's kind of hard to differentiate. I don't think I've really hit a home run on that yet. I think I just got the first base here. Let's see if we can
Keep going.
round the bases a little bit more. Double reflection is something that can reflect two different and opposing ways or views because of the ambiguity of the paradox or the bringing opposites together. So I think this is what I was trying to get at here, is that Kierkegaard is now talking about double reflection. Something can come out two different ways. It can come out as a paradox, having two opposing viewpoints. So it can be taken as direct or indirect because of its ambiguity. So that's kind of the best that I can answer it right now.
I do not envy the task that you have on here. I'm asking you, Bob, can you very succinctly define Christ's being? Could you very succinctly define the entire nature of the paradox and all the levels that it works on? Could you very succinctly describe what knowledge is and its effects on the human psyche? I mean, this is a Herculean task.
Well, Luke, don't think that I'm not sitting here sweating bullets, because I'm going to need a towel pretty soon.
I can see this is tough. I can see you squirming a little today, which I take only the slightest delight in, because you're almost always in perfect and total control, and it has nothing to do with your command of this material. It's just that these are mysteries that resist complete codification into English language. And I think what we're seeing here is the most gifted teacher in the world running up against the nature of the Christian paradox.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about the gifted but yes, running up against the paradox most certainly. Yes, and it's very delicate, because I realize the responsibility of being a teacher, as you do, is that people listen to us and give it credibility. And the last thing I want to do is to mislead anybody. So I want to make sure I have it right. As right as I, at least right to the point that I believe it's right, before I kind of just throw an answer out there. So it is a very delicate issue. So we go
keep going.
Okay, so we go to lesson 4 now, which he calls the impossibility of direct communication is in Christ, the mystery of his suffering. So there's a suffering, which is a suffering of inwardness, which he calls soul suffering. So Kierkegaard speaks now about suffering, the suffering of Christ. But it's not what everybody thinks, according to Kierkegaard. This happens when one lives in his unrecognizableness, at least in the case of Christ. So we know, eventually we found out, Christ is God. But Christ did not live as though he were God. It was an unrecognizable state. People didn't stand around him. The disciples didn't stand around him and say, "Oh, I reckon you're God, right? Right, you got it." No, it wasn't that kind of a relationship. Jesus had to maintain his, what he's going to call his incognito. So he was seen as a human rather than God, or rather than divine. He was seen as a teacher. Even Nicodemus says, "Yes, we know you are a teacher sent from God." He didn't say, "Yes, we know you're divine. We know you're God." But he says, "You're a teacher sent from God." They gave him that much. Okay? At least Nicodemus did. But what Kierkegaard is saying is the hardest suffering to bear is because Jesus loved us, but must yet hide his heartfelt emotion. He loved mankind. He loved his disciples. And he even loved the Pharisees. But he couldn't let it out in heartfelt emotion. Now, there were times that he showed his emotion, that he cried for Zacharias? One of the followers that he had who died, and he cried. He literally cried because he missed him, because of his heartfelt emotion. So we know Jesus was an emotional man, but he had to somehow hold this back and couldn't let the disciples see this emotion. So, in other words, he must hide his full and complete love for them, and also even for us. His humaneness could not allow him to show divine love because of the medium through which he appeared, through his flesh, and the ministry which he had to accomplish. So while he was here on earth, he was incognito. And the suffering that Jesus had was knowing who he was and knowing what he had to do, and yet not be able to share it with them so that they could fully understand him until his mission was accomplished. So he says we're not placed in the perfect understanding of love and friendship. So even for us, I think when we have love for one another, we're not always able to fully express that love so that the other person can fully grasp how much we love them, whether it's a friendship or a romantic love. So we even have that problem. And there's a certain type of suffering that one goes through when the other person doesn't get it. They don't get how much we really love them. There's a sense of almost cruelty here because there is no sense of love that's obvious, for God cannot make himself obvious directly. Therefore, his love cannot be obvious. So the frustration that Jesus had was that he couldn't make his love known to mankind directly, but he had to do it indirectly. So man was not able to really appreciate it while he was still at that time.
And that's a profound thing to try to comprehend. Is the profound aloneness and isolation that Jesus must have experienced in him not being able to fully communicate himself.
I mean, like
Really?
you and I, we have each other. Like a lot of times in our little pre-show, we talk to one another, and we can talk at a higher level that we talk to each other at a real friendship level, and we can share that with one another, and it's always feel good. I always look forward to those times because there's not a lot of people who we can share what we believe at the level that we discuss it. And
Right.
sometimes it makes us feel alone because we can't have that with everybody. So just that,
if those conversations weren't so explosive, we really should record those.
yeah. So in Kierkegaard's world, Christ must crucify all human compassion, because he must be the object of faith, not pity or sympathy or anything else. Now, talk about a profound statement. This is one I've never heard anywhere else, and this is so beautiful and so meaningful to me, and yet so almost blasphemous. He says we must crucify all human compassion for Christ, because he must be the object of faith and not pity or sympathy. And the danger here is in the scenes. The pastors also do this, and movies do this. And I think I mentioned this before. They reveal the painful crucifixion. This is the climax of the movie. Jesus being beaten to death, suffering, putting the crown of thorns, the nails into his... The narratives are so sadistic. They're on the verge of sadism when they show Jesus' crucifixion, because they bring out man's compassion and man's pity for Jesus and his sympathy for Jesus. But this is not what the Gospels wanted. They didn't do this.
But doesn't having the... I know the idea of having compassion for Jesus is to humanize him and to slip into the problem, the forked problem we had earlier, and to turn him into a man, like we discussed when emphasizing his humanity or emphasizing his divinity through direct communication. But doesn't having compassion on the physical exploitation that he experienced and the mental anguish that he experienced as a result of his profound loneliness, doesn't that make us appreciate what he did for us? Can't we feel that compassion and have our sense of reverence for him elevated at the same time? Isn't that the whole thing, is to understand like the tremendous burden that he took on for us?
The simple answer would be yes, but many times, passion simply runs away with it. And we confuse compassion with faith. And we depend upon our pastors to correct this, but they're not correcting it. The movies are not really ending the way they need to end. Remember, Jesus says, I'm trying to think, I'm sorry, I can't quote it, but when the women...
Well, that's how they get sequels. That's how they make their money.
Yeah, that's true. But do you remember, and it's probably not brought about in many of the movies, but when Jesus is being crucified and he's walking around the street carrying the cross, and the women are crying for them, the women and Jesus turns around and he says, "Don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves. Don't cry for me. Cry for yourselves." He's telling them that, this is necessary. I have to go through this. But there's something higher here than just crying for me. You need to go beyond your passion, your sympathy for me as a man. And so sometimes this is what needs to be brought out in the crucifixion today. Don't cry for Jesus the man, Go beyond that. Make his life worthwhile. Make his punishment worthwhile. How do you do that? With faith. So we have to make that transition, like you said, passion to faith. If we don't make that transition from one to the other, the passion is not going to be getting us into the kingdom of heaven. So this is the confusion. Because you cry, at these movies, this is not the same thing as devoting your life to Christ.
Can I ask a potentially heretical question?
Absolutely. You usually do anyway.
Not for the sake of being heretical, but just for conceptual clarification.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any chance that Jesus didn't feel the pain as intensely as a regular human would? Do you think there's any chance that he may, that from the outside appearance, he may have been bloodied and nailed through and all these other things? Do you, because I mean, there are people that don't have the proper pain receptors and block, the people can experience pain in different ways, right? You go to the medical doctor's office and you point to the different emoji or has anyone ever asked this question before? If like Jesus really felt the pain of crucifixion? I know this is like a heretical question, but I'm just like wondering how it fits. Like, presumably like, there's where is it in the Bible where some of the early Christians are like put into ovens, but there's like an angel there that protects them from actually feeling the death. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Well, Daniel, in the story of Daniel, they were thrown in Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. I remember that when they were thrown into the fiery oven. Yeah. But the angel was in there protecting them. Is that the story you're speaking about?
I think, that's the one I'm speaking about. So they were being martyred or are dying for God, but they didn't necessarily feel the pain. Is there any chance that Jesus escaped this torment and it only looked like he experienced it?
That's the way you word it. Is there any chance? There's a chance, but is there any evidence? Is there anything that should lead us to believe that? No. Jesus, and the reason, Luke, is because his sacrifice would have been, what was the word? I just had the word, diminished. For the lambs who died in the sacrifices in the temples, under the temple system, they weren't numbed. They weren't given whiskey or something to numb their pain. They were slaughtered, period. Doesn't talk about anything that they were given anything to numb it or make it any less violent. And so for Christ, there's no evidence that it needed to be. He had to suffer the pain. Because it would be, again, the sacrifice would have been diminished. It would not have been real as it was for Christ.
Why? We're off some crazy rabbit holes here, but why do you think it's important for God to experience the extremes of human pain?
Why was it important?
I'm pretty much asking you unanswerable questions, but I'm just.
Jesus had to be fully human, and he had he had to be. It had to be a test too, because if he didn't experience pain the way we do, he could have said, "Yeah, I can do this. This is no big piece of cake. I don't feel anything here, and in a few minutes I'm going to fall asleep and be dead." Right. But if he did feel the pain, then it makes it that much. It makes it different because it's a test of Christ's faith, that he was willing to suffer the pain and go through with it, rather than be easy. It wasn't an easy thing. And so the way I would answer it is that, yes, he had to suffer the pain because pain was part of the process. Pain makes it a sacrifice. If there was no pain, it wouldn't have been such a sacrifice.
See this, and this raises all sorts of interesting questions about the separateness and connectedness of the entities and the Trinity. And I've already asked enough blasphemous things, but
No, not really. No.
but I'm saying, like, in the sense that, God being so infinite, like, even if in this particular body of Christ, there was an extreme amount of pain going on, right? It would have been rather minuscule given the magnitude of God if they all are interconnected, right? Like if I have if I, gosh, I'm, do you understand what I'm saying? Like if I have a pain in a small part of my body,
Yeah.
like it's different from the entire body being in total pain. And we're essentially, what I'm doing here is I'm running up against the paradox again.
Yeah.
Because what the paradox is that the infinity of God is contained within the finite body of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to explain it
Well,
away.
you're trying to solve the paradox.
I am. I see myself. I'm falling into the trap.
That's the
and
trap.
I need to stop myself. I just fell into the trap on live YouTube.
But let me give you why I believe that he felt the pain too. It just came to me. It's that when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he didn't say, okay, it's about time for me to go. Let's move it along here. Let's get it done. Jesus fell down 3 times, I think it was, and cried, and blood and sweat mingled, like drops of blood. He cried out to the Father, if there's any other way, please let it be. He wouldn't have said that if it was a piece of cake. I mean, he was serious. He knew he had to suffer. He knew there'd be pain. So that was the anticipation that he had to go through. God did not spare him. The Father did not spare him this. He couldn't spare him this, because then he wouldn't have been fully human. So I know we all, like my brother, has a very high threshold of pain. Me, I'm a little girl when it comes to pain. So it would be different for both of us. If he was crucified and I were crucified, the level of pain would be different. So I don't know where Jesus' level of pain would fit in. But yeah. So that's all I gotta say about that.
All right. Well, I'll stop trying to solve the paradox.
But you can see how easy it is to fall into that. Well, how can he be God and man? There's got to be a solution here. And Kierkegaard says, no, that's not what the paradox is for. Okay.
Well, so we should probably, I don't know how much more you want to try to achieve. We probably, I think we've been going for close to an hour and a half. Which
yeah, we could stop now.
It's a good amount of time.
Okay.
Oh, you want to stop now? Or do you
well,
want to
I
keep
can
going
continue on a little bit further here. I was going to try to finish this thing, but it's going to take too long to get there. So let me just finish this section here, this lesson here. Actually, it's a good thing to do it now, because I think, let's see if I could find where I was. Okay, got sadistic movies. Okay, according to Kierkegaard, this is not the way to approach the gospel, through sadism. This was also not the way the gospel writers approached it. The gospel writers did not dwell upon this, especially even in Mark. It was there. They explained they mentioned what was done, and then it was over. But this is the approach from the human point of view. This makes us see Jesus as a martyr or a victim at the hands of humans. So it has a negative effect. It may build passion in us, but it also makes us see Jesus as more of a martyr and a victim at the hands of humans. And let me give you a twist on this. This comes from me. A little bit more, some Kierkegaard too, perhaps. But rather, we must see the act of crucifixion from the point of view of God the Father, where it was an act of love. And from the Father's point of view, he's giving his Son over to have him tortured and murdered by humanity. The question is, what kind of a father would do something like this? Such an act elicits offense and not sympathy. So when we see the act from Jesus' point of view, we might say, oh, poor Jesus is going through a martyrdom, he's going through this torture, and we can feel sorry, and we can have all these human feelings come out. But that's not the point of view we are necessarily to see it from. We are to see it from the Father's point of view here. Now, when we look at it from that point of view, we see something completely different.
I was going to say, because it's not it's disanalogous because God is all of our fathers. God is all of it. Each one of us has God as Father.
Yes.
Right?
Father to us all.
Right. So Jesus doesn't have an exclusive claim on Jehovah as his Father. He's the Father of all, right?
Yeah.
And God and Jesus are, because of the limits of human language, we call them Father and Son, but they interpenetrate and they're not separable beings in the same way that me and my Father are separable beings.
Yeah.
So to make this, like, what kind of father would sacrifice his son? I mean, God is sacrificing himself for the sake of all his other children, right?
Right. So let's go to an Old Testament example. When we think of the story of Abraham, okay, and in his motions of going through to offer Isaac his son, who is the father of faith in this story?
I mean, we're told that it's Abraham.
Okay, why not Isaac?
Well, you know what? I've read some apocryphal texts. I'll tell you what, someone needs to write a book about Kierkegaard and the book of Jasher and all this other stuff. And I know you don't take the but it's interesting in I believe in Jasher, and I've said this before, Jasher. Isaac was like all about it. Isaac, from that perspective, like, he was being just as obedient. Isaac knew, and he was like into it. Like, he wanted to be part of this thing as well. And you could make the case from that perspective that Isaac was being as faithful as Abraham too. But that's not what we have within the canon. But
okay, what we need to do is look at this as in its totality, in its holistic way. We don't want to separate. We have to look at the event as a whole event. Okay? And the same thing with Jesus and his Father. We have to see the event as a whole event happening. And otherwise we get into even more difficult paradoxes. So, but in this event here, we see God as the Father of Christ. I forgot what the point I wanted to make here. But we see that we see the story from a whole different way. So we need to include the Father as the one who's offering up the Son. So it's important to see the whole event, not just the one event. Because the most important event, it's not really so much alone that Jesus offered his life, but the event is that God offered his only Son. That's really what we hear echoed in the New Testament. That Jesus was the offering of God, his only Son. Not so much emphasizing Jesus' torture and Jesus' pain, but emphasizing the gift of the Father to the world. So we have to see the whole thing as a total event, from the Father's point and the Son's point together. Just like with Abraham and Isaac. Well, we really can't leave Isaac out of this story. He's part of the story. Now, he could have got up and ran away. And then where would Abraham have been?
Well, yeah, in Jasher, it's interesting. He's like, please bind me so tight. He was like, in Jasher, he's like, make sure you like really bind me up tight. So like when the pain happens, I don't run away.
Right.
He was like begging for it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, just to kind of look at it a little differently, we need to see it from the Father's point of view as well as the Son's point of view. Now, page 123, Jesus suffered inwardly as well as outwardly, is what he's continuing on this theme. He suffered at the hands of a friend who betrayed him, right? Judas betrayed him. That had to hurt, and he was left alone and deserted by his followers. When they came to get him, everybody ran away. His disciples ran away. That had to hurt too. This inward suffering becomes an offense in the eyes of the world. it is this inward suffering that Parsons ought to be preaching, according to Kierkegaard. So instead of preaching the outward suffering of the cross, they should be preaching the inward suffering that Jesus had. He died, and the disciples were nowhere to be found. Just John was in. We understand John was there, but John, if what I think is true, he was not one of the 12 disciples. He was a disciple, but not one of the 12. And he stood with Mary. So he had a very small, his intimate group of friends disappeared. They all left him. This is the inward suffering Kierkegaard thinks that Parsons should bring up.
How did you get to the conclusion that John wasn't one of the disciples?
Because there were some.
I mean, that's a pretty big claim.
It is.
I mean, I'm not going to say you're wrong. I just hadn't. It's like, what? I hadn't heard that.
Okay,
before.
I'll run it through real quickly. There were several Johns, numerous Johns in the New Testament, and there was John who was a disciple, but there was also another John who was a disciple in the Gospel of John who goes in to when Jesus is arrested, and he goes into the high priest's home, and Peter is outside. Peter can't get in. Remember when he denies Jesus? Yet there's another disciple who walks right in to the high priest's home, unquestioned. And we find out that this John also is not challenged at the cross. Why isn't John challenged? Hey, you're one of the disciples. We're going, we need to take you in too. Why didn't John run away? And there's other questions that go unanswered, which I won't deal with here. But So
your contention is that he wasn't a disciple at that time and he became one later?
He was a disciple, but not an apostle. He was one of the many who followed Jesus intimately, but he wasn't one of the 12. Now, it turns out very interestingly, there are some writings of the New Testament from the Church Fathers that allude to John wearing the breastplate, I think it was, of the high priest. Now, we also find out it was, who's the high priest again? Not Nicodemus.
Is it Caiaphas?
Caiaphas had 3 sons, I believe. And guess what one of his sons' names were?
John?
Yes. So that seems to answer a lot of questions. Why this John didn't run away? Why this John was able to go into the house of the high priest unobstructed?
Now, Bob, you know how I feel about this whole conspiracy theory talk.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, I don't really go for them very much. But if someone wanted to go out there and think their own thoughts and investigate this matter for themselves, can you recommend a source that people can look into this matter?
Not really,
because I don't do conspiracy theories for the record. But where could someone find out information about that?
Well, it would be a little obscure, but the information exists in the writings of the history of the church under Herodotus. Herodotus' history of the church. So I think that's what it was. So where I found it.
That sounds like a lot of work, but maybe I'll get around to it.
Yeah, so it's in one of the writings. I can't remember who it was. I'm trying to think now to narrow it down a little more. But it was one of the church fathers, early church fathers, when questioned who wrote the Gospel of John. If you search who wrote the Gospel of John on the internet, you will find some of the sources. So unfortunately, I don't have them off the top of my head. There's not a lot of books written about it. because it's still quite controversial. But there are some very good theologians that I respect a great deal who really offer this as a valid option. So I would just kind of leave it there. But if you search on it, you'll find a plethora of information, and you'll find the actual quote there, as well as to where it was in the history of Herodotus.
Yeah, I'm getting some information here that it's really attributed to Anonymous, and that it's part of the Johannine community. So that looks very interesting.
Okay.
All right, let's wrap it up.
Okay. So the last sentence here is, in order to reveal faith, an offense must be present, as it was in the act of Abraham and Isaac, as it was in the act of God the Father and Son. It was an offense, and it is an offense. Now, if you remove it and replace it with passion and compassion, it's no longer an offense. But Kierkegaard wants us to see the offense in the crucifixion. Where is the offense? It's the offense that the Father should do such a thing.
Or that a God could die.
Or a God to God, yeah.
Depending on what aspect of the paradox you want to look at. And going back to what we said earlier, I don't know if direct communication is offensive in the same way as these things are offensive. Direct communication can be offensive because it can be something people don't want to hear, like Jesus is God, right? So it can offend their sensibility. Be like, no, Apollo is God, or I am God, or whatever their other conception of God. It can offend them in that way.
Yeah.
But it seems like the offense of indirect communication, like a God suffering on a cross, or Jesus not acknowledging himself to be God when he's like walking on water and all this other stuff, that offends because there's a lack of concreteness of an answer that requires choice to make a decision and this reflection. Yeah. So there's different types of offensives. A direct proclamation can be offensive because we just don't like it. And then the offense of indirect communication can be that it doesn't fit our logical mental categories and leaves us with a dilemma that we ultimately can't logically resolve and we must choose.
Right.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Got it?
Excellent. The student becomes the teacher.
Yeah. All right.
Oh, very good.
I want to thank Robert Schut for an invigorating conversation today. I liked this conversation. You let me go way out there. I like going way out there. I hope the audience doesn't hate me too much for going.
Oh, I don't think so. Because I think
they might just want the direct communication. Bob, just give me the facts. Oh, Luke, stop intruding with your heretical questions. But thank you for listening. I would like to say just thank you for being a part of our lives, and I hope we are enriching yours. And if you appreciate what we're doing, go over to Noetic.online, be a part of that community, enjoy all the humanities education materials over there. Bob, would you like to say anything else?
Just thank you for enduring through our podcast. Sometimes it's not easy to be a listener, so thank you for listening.
You know what? I get comments. People say that this is helping them.
Oh, that's good. That's great.
Yeah. We might have gotten one or two people to register on God's calculator. We may have accelerated the
Okay.
All right. I'll talk to you again soon, okay, Bob?
Okay, blessings to all. Bye-bye.
All right.